My name is Sari van Poelje, and I'm an executive coach and team coach, and I'm an agile business innovation consultant. I also train people to do what I do in my school, Intact Academy. In this series of vlogs, blogs, and whatnot, I'm talking about executive coachings and the steps and the models you could use in that. So in the first one, we talked about a general model, then we talked about contact, contract, and problem definition. Now we're going to talk about interventions. So a lot of my students say, okay, so now I know where it hurts, but what do I do with a client? How do you do this? The ICF, the International Coaching Federation, has a guideline of criteria, like you ask powerful questions, you contract it, and they're quite good as a guideline to see what kind of interventions you can do. But I want to talk a bit more about what role do you actually have in executive coaching, and what we call the burn operations, but what are really interventions that you could do with a client. So the roles you can have, and I'll show you how I define those. The roles you can have in the executive coaching really span four things, and I got this from Bridget Proctor, and other people have written about this later. But when I do executive coaching, I really consider myself not just as someone who asks questions. I'm in many different roles at the same time, and it also kind of depends on the relationship you have with the client at the time. But anyway, when I meet a client, the first role I really have in that executive coaching is usually facilitative and educative, as the time, sometimes evaluative, and as time goes on, it becomes more consultative. At least that's my experience. So when we talk about this role, what do I mean? So a facilitative role, which is in the right-hand top corner, is really the role, the traditional role we think of when we do coaching. So we support professional and personal development, and we do that through asking powerful questions, through reflection, through paraphrasing, through really helping, facilitating self-reflection. A lot of the managers that come to me are not really good at self-reflection. They don't have the time, but they also don't always have the competency to look at what they're doing and the effect they have on others from a monitoring position. You can see me do this, and that's what we mean by self-reflection. This is like the traditional coaching role that most people think about. The second thing I find myself doing in executive coaching is an educative role. So I teach. Often the client comes to me and, I could ask them 1,000 questions, but really if they're asking me one-on-one, I sometimes just teach them too, because I can ask them, what do you feel about it? Or what do you think about it? But an easier route is sometimes to give them a small piece of information so they can frame their problem or frame their question themselves and then generalize the answer. Because we're not just giving a fish to people, we're teaching them how to fish. So hopefully they'll solve the problem during the executive coaching, but also they'll gain competencies to solve their own problems better in future. So part of my role in executive coaching is also educative. I focus on the client as the manager. In my case, I do a lot of executive coaching. And I teach them little bits of theory so they can frame their problem and understand all these different bits of information they have. What whole do those parts construct? I do that also because if you can help them find a frame and generalize their problem, it's much easier for them to find options instead of finding options for all those little things they have. My third role really is the evaluative role. You'll find that at the bottom right. So in this role, sometimes it's a normative evaluative role. Like sometimes an executive comes to me and I'm thinking, we have to do something else before what you're asking. So I'm thinking of a client who came in, completely harassed, on the phone. It was the first time I met him. I showed him to the door. He was still like this, completely tense. And I remember I asked him, how much do you actually sleep at night? He looked terrible. He looked, that gray tint underneath his skin. He was a young guy. He was in his 40s. And I thought, oh, this isn't going very well for him, I think. So at first he talked to me about, I've got this great organizational change role. Please help me lead that. And at a certain moment I said, how much do you sleep? And he said, oh, I sleep 4 hours a night. I don't need more than that. And I said, how long have you been doing this? He said, since the first time I had to change an organization, I've had interrupted sleep. So I wake up tired. And I thought, that's not really good. And then I said, so how about the other stuff? So are you eating regularly? He said, no, I don't really taste what I eat anymore. I go out with clients and I gained weight in the last years. And do you do sports? No, I've stopped. I used to play football with my friends. I stopped doing that. And here I was getting information about his social profile, really, and his at-risk profile for getting sick. My concern was, is this guy going to get burnout? So in that case, I think, I have an evaluative role as well, which is assessing. In this case, I had to say to him, as a normative role, I think it's really good if we or you work with someone else on improving your health at the same time as we're doing this. Because if something happens to you, there's no point in focusing on the organizational change, because you won't be there to do it. I didn't say it quite like that, but you understand what I mean. What also might be in the evaluative role is that people ask you to kind of help them calibrate where they are on their journey in leadership, and to give a comparison like, okay, this is where you could, if you want to move on to C-suite work, these are your strengths, and this is probably what we should focus on to develop. That's also an evaluative role in executive coaching. The fourth role that I really focus on is the consultative role. So I find that develops as time goes on. So when I know a client really well, they've done their personal and professional development for their immediate problem, and then we get into this role of sparring partner almost, where they're not only concerned about their own professional and personal issues, but they're more interested in the wider systemic context of that. And I find myself also moving with them in this, again, looking externally, focusing on what their effect is on their system. And I get into this consultative role in the executive coaching. And they're really, at this point, almost invariably, we're at the end of our executive coaching contract, because they're ready to move on. It's almost like they're crossing a threshold by using me as a consultant, checking out if they're in the right position in that field, and then moving on to the next step without me. And I think that's one of the things, really, I guess at the human level, to be truthful, we also teach people to say hello and to say goodbye. And I don't know what role that is, but I invite you to try out, these roles, and to check out, when do you do what? It might inform you about the type of executive or other coaching you do. Let me know.